Young single mother is barred from graduation party until a millionaire makes her his guest of honor. The luxurious ballroom was lit by crystal chandeliers when she arrived, clutching a crumpled invitation begging to be accepted. She wore a simple dress inherited from her mother and carried her small son in her arms, her eyes full of expectation. At the graduation party's gate, everyone stared at her as if she were a set design error. Security guards immediately stopped her, and a group of young men laughed loudly, pointing at her worn shoes and messy hair. "This is no place for people like you," one of them said dismissively. The boy squeezed his mother's hand, embarrassed by the laughter. The awkward silence spread, and every glance seemed to push her out. It was in that moment, before hundreds of judging eyes, that she felt the cruel weight of the world, the stigma of being poor, a single mother, and daring to want to be part of something bigger. But the collective laughter ceased as if time had frozen. A deep voice echoed among the guests, "She's coming in with me." Everyone turned, and there he was, the young millionaire no one dared cross, heir to one of the country's greatest fortunes. She wore an impeccable suit and walked with the confidence of someone holding power in her hands. He extended his arm to her as if she were a bridesmaid and stared at the security guards until they made way. Their scornful looks turned to shock. What no one knew was that this gesture wasn't one of pure kindness. There were secrets from the past that linked those two lives in an invisible knot, a secret that would forever change their destinies. In that instant, public humiliation became a spectacle, and the silence turned to anticipation. The city lights spread across the horizon like a sea of artificial stars, reflecting in the mirrored windows of New York's tallest buildings. That night, the state's most prestigious university seemed like the center of the world. It was the law school graduation party, an event that brought together heirs, influential businessmen, and entire families proud to see their children about to occupy positions of power. The chosen venue was a historic hotel on Fifth Avenue, with a vaulted ceiling and marble columns, where crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow that gave the space an almost celestial air. Men in sharp suits, women in shimmering dresses, champagne flutes circulated amid haughty laughter and occasional applause. It was the kind of place where image mattered more than truth, where everyone wore social masks to disguise their fragility. Among the crowd, the young graduates greeted one another as if they were already on a stage of power. Many carried the arrogance of those born with a silver spoon in their mouth, but there were also insecure looks, disguised behind practiced smiles. It was a celebration not only of academic achievement, but of status. Each guest's presence served as a seal of social approval. The name on each invitation carried the weight of belonging. Being there was confirmation of membership in the elite. At the main entrance, the red carpet stretched out as if it were the path to an inevitable destination. Imported cars pulled up one after the other, letting out young men in tailored suits and women with jewelry that reflected every camera flash. A hired photographer captured every smile, every pose, every detail to feed social magazines. The atmosphere was one of pure ostentation, almost a public display of who could do the most. And yet, behind so much glittering beauty, there hovered a cold and cruel air. That place didn't tolerate mistakes, didn't tolerate improvisation, and didn't accept people who didn't fit into the gilded frame everyone pretended to uphold. And that was precisely why her arrival caused such discomfort. No private driver, no designer dress, no fancy makeup. Just a young mother, with firm steps, yet hesitant inside. Her small son clutched her arm, her eyes curious at the radiance they had never witnessed before. Many noticed her. Some chuckled discreetly, others frowned as if her presence were a nuisance. She didn't belong there, and the atmosphere made it clear, even without words, that daring to cross that carpet without the seal of wealth was a social sin. The night hadn't even begun, but it already presented itself as an inevitable stage of contrasts. On one side, power concentrated in crystal glasses and calculated smiles. On the other, a young woman who carried within her not only simplicity, but also invisible scars that made her even more strange in that setting. However, in that hall where everything seemed immutable and predictable, A spectacle no one could control was about to unfold, a silent confrontation between appearance and essence, between pride and truth, between the arrogance of many and the resistance of one. Her past wasn't made up of framed photographs on the wall, but of silences broken, by arguments behind closed doors, and tears hidden in her pillow. She grew up in a small town in the American countryside, where the cold wind always seemed to seep through the cracks of humble homes. Her absent father left only the memory of a suitcase being dragged through the door, shouting at her in an argument she was too young to understand, but old enough to feel the emptiness that would remain. Her overwhelmed mother struggled between double shifts at restaurants and laundromats, trying to keep her daughter fed, even at the cost of her own health. From an early age, she learned that nothing would be given to her for free, and that every small achievement would come at the price of exhaustion. At school, she bore the invisible mark of poverty. Her classmates laughed at her mismatched clothes, her notebooks patched with duct tape, her almost always empty lunchbox. The bullying wasn't just childish, it was a cruel reminder that she was always outside the accepted norm. And yet, even amid so much rejection, there was a raw strength, a quiet obstinacy that kept her standing tall. She learned to work early, cleaning other people's houses, caring for children who had more toys than she could ever dream of. The world seemed intent on crushing her, but each humiliation left a scar that, instead of destroying her, strengthened her resilience. At 17, she believed she had found love. A young man who promised her a future, swore care, and spoke of shared dreams. But promises made in youth often fall apart before they mature. When he discovered her pregnancy, he disappeared without a backward glance, leaving only a bitter memory of abandonment. The news spread quickly through the small town, making her the target of judgmental looks and venomous whispers. A single mother before she even began her life, they said, as if it were an eternal sentence of failure. It was then that she made her bravest choice. She left behind the city that suffocated her and set off for New York, carrying only an old suitcase, her young son, and a silent faith that she could start over. Life wasn't kind. She shared a room in a noisy tenement, worked long shifts as a waitress, and studied at night in free courses, always trying to learn something new that might open a door. On her darkest days, she walked the city's bright streets, gazing at window displays she could never buy, but she used that as fuel, a reminder that she didn't want her son to grow up believing the world was made only of closed doors. There were nights when hunger outweighed sleep, and she chose to give her son his last meal of the day, pretending she had no appetite. There were also days when exhaustion nearly made her give up, but all she had to do was look into his curious, trusting eyes to find hidden strength. He was her reason, her anchor, and her driving force. And it was for him that, even without a formal invitation, she decided to face the glitter and judgment of the graduation party. She wasn't seeking recognition or applause. She simply wanted to show her son that dreams didn't belong only to the rich. She wanted to prove, albeit silently, that she too had the right to walk across that hall, even if her entire life had been a constant push away. The room was already buzzing with voices and laughter as the fate of the evening began to be stitched together by invisible threads. Among the tables decorated with arrangements of white roses and the crystal glasses raised. In continuous toasts, a group of young men occupied the center of attention. They were the wealthiest heirs of the bunch, sons of judges, bankers, and businessmen, accustomed to measuring power with sharp words and ostentation. Among them, the youngest and most admired millionaire, impeccably suited and confidently smiling, observed everything with the calm of someone who knew nothing was being denied him. Between glasses and jokes, someone challenged, "I bet you wouldn't have the courage to bring someone who doesn't belong to this world as your guest." The challenge was laced with sarcasm, mocking the idea of tarnishing the evening's brilliance with the presence of someone ordinary. He, perhaps out of pride or perhaps boredom, didn't back down. He responded with cold irony, promising to prove that even the impossible could be molded by his hands. And then, as if it were just a cruel game to fill the void in their perfect lives, the bet was made. The humiliation had been planned, even before she appeared. To them, the idea of a young single mother attempting to cross that hall was nothing more than a social joke, a spectacle of derision that would be remembered for weeks in the closed gossip circles. When she arrived, holding her son's hand and the crumpled invitation she kept like a relic, the muffled laughter intensified. It wasn't just the simplicity of the dress, it was the audacity of someone trying to enter where she wasn't truly invited. For many, this would become confirmation that she never belonged in that circle. The exchanged glances, the whispers, the cell phones already raised to discreetly record the scene, everything lined up like part of a cruel choreography. The humiliation wasn't accidental, it was the expected spectacle. As she tried to explain to the security guards that she had received the invitation, someone in the back commented loud enough for everyone to hear, "It must be fake. There's no way people like that have a place here." The laughter that followed echoed like a knife cutting through the air. Her son, still young, didn't understand the cruelty of the words, but he felt the weight of the stares and cowered against his mother's body. His heart raced, but his eyes remained firm, as if refusing to cry was his last shield against the crowd. At that moment, the bet seemed won before it even began. They wanted to see her retreat, leave the room, confirm the narrative that worlds should never mix. And yet, what no one expected was for the story to take an unexpected turn. The millionaire, until then silent, watched from a distance with a look that mixed arrogance and something deeper, something even he himself didn't understand. The game, begun for pure fun, was about to become much more than a spectacle. Unbeknownst to anyone, the pieces of fate were already moving to transform the evening into a silent judgment of all present. A heavy silence hung in the entrance as he advanced among the guests, each step echoing like a break in the script everyone was expecting. The young millionaire, an admired and feared heir, stood before her with the firm posture of someone who had never needed to ask permission for anything. The disconcerted security guards immediately backed away, as if recognizing the invisible hierarchy that dominated the space. He extended his hand toward her, and for an instant, time seemed to freeze. She, still clutching her son, hesitated to accept. It wasn't just distrust. It was wounded pride mixed with a survival instinct. But his eyes, as intense as they were cold, seemed to command without words. "Come in with me." The scene unfolded before hundreds of stunned gazes. The seemingly simple gesture carried the force of a social shock. The young mother, previously barred, now walked the red carpet beside the man who symbolized power and wealth. Her every step was accompanied by whispers, each forced smile concealing the venom of judgment. Still, his hand holding hers created a frame impossible to ignore. She was no longer the poor woman daring to invade, but the guest of honor chosen by the evening's undeclared host himself. Inside the ballroom, the contrast became even starker. While the women wore embroidered dresses and sparkling jewelry, she wore a simple, dull dress, imbued with quiet dignity. Her son, curious, observed the grand details of the room with shining eyes, oblivious to the weight of the criticism still hanging in the air. He, the millionaire, seemed to revel in the tension he had created. He seated her at the table closest to the center stage, facing all the graduates, as if to make it clear that his word was law. And then came the first exchange, dry, unexpected, almost a duel of wits. He leaned in slightly and said softly, just so she could hear, "Now everyone knows you're with me. There's no reason to feel inferior." She stared at him, surprised, and replied in a firm tone, at odds with the fragility they'd expected of her, "I'm not with you, I'm here for my son, and I won't thank you for something that should be a right." The simple phrase cut through the air between them like an invisible blade. He watched her for a few seconds, and something appeared in her eyes that no one there had ever seen in him, a spark of discomfort. He was accustomed to obedient smiles, to words tailored to please, but this young woman seemed unwilling to bow to his gesture of power. It was as if the simple act of walking beside him hadn't transformed her into a pawn in the game. There was a silent resistance in her that intrigued and irritated at the same time, and without her realizing it, the bet that had begun as a whim was about to become an emotional battleground that would change both their lives forever. In the ballroom, the tension quickly turned into a cruel spectacle. The tables were arranged like silent bleachers, and every eye seemed eager to see the next act. She, still beside him, tried to maintain her posture, but felt the invisible weight of the whispers that cut through the air like sharp knives. The women looked her up and down, analyzing every seam of her simple dress as if it were a garment from another era. Some young men chuckled softly, raising their glasses in toasts disguised as mockery. It was as if they were all united by a single desire, to see her break. The millionaire, rather than dispelling the hostility, seemed to encourage it with his calculated indifference. Sitting beside her, he smiled enigmatically, as if watching a play of his own creation. When the master of ceremonies called the graduates to the stage, some took the opportunity to drop hints. Not everyone can afford to be here, but some have generous sponsors. Laughter erupted, spreading like wildfire. She understood it wasn't just rejection, it was the plan working, the gamble disguised as coincidence. The son, too young to understand the venom of the words, only noticed the change in the adults' tone. He shrank into his mother's lap, and that was enough to shatter her heart into 1,000 pieces. The desire to protect the boy from the world was greater than the desire to defend himself. But when she tried to get up discreetly to leave, he grabbed her wrist firmly, almost imperceptibly to the others, and murmured with a cold smile, "It's not over yet. You're not leaving now." The next scene was orchestrated as an inevitable public humiliation. One of the girls in the class, blonde, wearing a dress straight out of a fashion magazine, approached the table and with a venomous smile commented loudly, "How adorable. Did you bring your nanny to the party?" The collective laughter was immediate, thunderous, like an explosion of perverse applause. The protagonist's face burned, but her eyes held no tears. There was a hidden strength there, a quiet pride that the others mistook for weakness. The millionaire simply watched, as if gauging every reaction. For many, he was complicit in this spectacle, for not intervening, for not using his commanding voice to silence the attacks. But deep down, what no one noticed was that there was something in his expression that didn't quite match amusement. It was almost as if he were testing not only the cruelty of others, but also her own resilience. A kind of cruel social experiment in which she was the protagonist without a choice. And then, at the height of her contempt, when the collective laughter seemed unbearable, she lifted her face and stared at everyone. The silence that followed wasn't because she screamed or cried, but because there was an unexpected firmness in her eyes. It was as if she were saying, without words, "You can laugh at me, but you can't erase me." It was a cruel humiliation, but also the first glimpse that this night wouldn't end as everyone expected. The contempt that tried to crush her would, sooner or later, be the weight that would fall on them. The night had already transformed into a silent battlefield, where every glance cast at her was an invisible arrow. And yet, amid the crushing weight of that humiliation, something in her eyes began to shine differently. It wasn't resignation, it wasn't fear. It was the certainty of someone carrying a hidden card up their sleeve, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. While the others still laughed, satisfied with the collective cruelty, she settled her son in her lap, lifted her chin, and in a calm but firm tone, let out words that made the entire room freeze. "Do you think I don't know what's going on here?" she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The sentence cut through the air like a blade. Many exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others laughed, trying to hide their surprise. But she didn't stop. "Do you think I'm blind, that I don't realize the idiotic bet you made? That I'm just your toy on this night of golden masks?" The silence spread, almost suffocating. The laughter died on the lips of those most amused, and even the millionaire, who until then seemed to own the scene, leaned in slightly to observe her more closely. The son, not understanding, simply looked at her confidently, as if sensing his mother wasn't being defeated, but lifted up. And she continued, without lowering her eyes, challenging everyone with the courage born of years of wounds. "You judge me by the dress, the crumpled invitation, the child I carry within me. But you know nothing about me. You don't know the battles I've survived, nor what I'm capable of enduring. This party for you is the pinnacle of life. For me, it's just another room full of people who believe money buys dignity. I'm not here to prove anything to you, but to show my son that life doesn't bow to contempt." The words, filled with pain and fire, echoed like an invisible punch. Many looked away, others swallowed hard. The millionaire, for the first time that night, lost his ironic smile. His face showed a mixture of surprise and discomfort, as if he hadn't anticipated this outcome. He was no longer the absolute driver of the scene. For the first time she had taken control of the narrative, and not with screams or tears, but with a revelation that dismantled the entire cruel performance. A heavy silence fell over the room, and no one dared laugh again. She had known from the start. She knew she was being used as a betting pawn. She knew her presence was unwelcome. She knew the scorn would come. And yet, she chose to enter. This revelation not only broke the logic of the game, but also exposed the fragility of those who believed themselves superior. It was as if, in that instant, the humiliation had become a mirror, turning the cruelty back on the tormentors themselves. The millionaire, leaning back in his chair, stared at her in silence. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he had no ready answer. She had turned the tables, and the entire room, which had previously applauded his power, now waited to see how he would react to being disarmed by someone who, in their eyes, should have no voice. After her revelation, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of silverware hitting plates and the forced laughter of some still trying to save face. He, the millionaire, couldn't take his eyes off her. At first he thought she was just a poor girl, useful for proving a point to her friends. But the way she spoke, her confident tone, her courage to expose her game to everyone, there was something different, something that went beyond the image of a humiliated single mother. It was as if she carried a strength that he, with all his wealth, had never experienced. That early morning, after the party continued with artificial merriment, he began to investigate. His family's power gave him access to any information. All it took was a connection, an order, and secrets that should have remained locked away were revealed before him. But this time, it wasn't just curiosity. There was a restlessness gnawing at him. Who was she, after all? And why could her presence, so simple and unlikely, destabilize him more than any business rival? Within hours, names began to emerge in discrete files, and that was when he discovered the first unexpected connection. Years ago, her father had laid off dozens of workers at one of his companies in a cruel restructuring that left entire families destitute. Among those families was hers. The young woman's mother had been one of the employees sacrificed by a decision that never considered the lives behind the numbers. He read the reports and realized that the layoff had forced her to work 3 different jobs until she fell ill. And that, after her death, her daughter, the girl now before him, was forced to shoulder the burden of survival alone. But that wasn't all. There was more. Digging through university records, he discovered that she had applied to the same institution where the graduation ceremony was now taking place. She was one of the brightest students in high school, recommended by teachers who saw a promising future in her. However, lacking resources, she had given up on the application when she realized that, even with scholarships, she wouldn't be able to afford the costs of living and studying there. The detail that struck him hard was seeing that her application had been archived the same year he himself entered university, surrounded by privileges he never questioned. The millionaire, accustomed to seeing others as disposable pieces, felt the weight of something unfamiliar: guilt. Her life, marked by scars and pain, was directly linked to the choices and power her family had always wielded without remorse. It was no coincidence that she was there that night. Fate had somehow drawn them both into the same room, as if it were an invisible judgment. He began to realize that nothing that happened was a coincidence. She wasn't just a girl who dared to trespass where she shouldn't. She was a living reminder of the wounds her wealth had caused. The secret was now clear. The humiliation she suffered wasn't just social, it was historical. It was the echo of a past in which her family had ripped the ground from under her feet. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, there was no longer any escaping the truth. After that night, she didn't reappear. She didn't respond to the curious glances that followed her. She didn't give the city space to turn her pain into gossip. She simply vanished, as if she'd dissolved into the silence of New York. For many, it was merely expected. Someone like her didn't belong in that world, and so her disappearance seemed natural. But for him, the millionaire, the emptiness that remained was different. It was as if the room had lost its luster since she'd walked out the door, taking with it the weight of the words that echoed restlessly in his mind. In the early days, he tried to convince himself it was nothing more than a poorly played game. A gamble that had spiraled out of control. He kept telling himself there was no reason to care about someone who wasn't part of his circle, who didn't share his reality. But deep down, something was eating away at him. Images of her facing everyone, steadfastly defying the crowd, came back like flashes in his memory. Her silence in the face of cruelty, her courage to stand up against humiliation, her revelation that she knew everything. None of it fit the narrative he'd always believed about the weak. He began searching for signs. He discreetly sent them to find information about her residence, but the addresses he received were vague, temporary, as if she were always passing through, never truly established. He visited the same places in the city where he believed she might be, simple cafes, community libraries, parks where mothers took their children, but he couldn't find her. Her disappearance wasn't just physical. It was almost as if she'd been erased from the map, leaving only the memory of her presence like a haunting ghost. It was in this silence that he began to feel the weight of absence. He discovered that the luxurious life, surrounded by parties, women, and friends who smiled only when glasses were raised, no longer fulfilled anything. Every laugh seemed false, every night felt empty. And worse, he began to realize he had never felt this longing for anyone. She of all people, whom he had used in a game of humiliation, was now the only presence capable of filling the void he had never dared to acknowledge. There were nights when he found himself alone, staring at his own reflection in the mirror, wondering who he really was, the powerful heir everyone revered, or the restless man who couldn't forget the steady gaze of a mother who faced the world in a simple dress with her child in her arms. The answer never came. Only silence. A silence that consumed him more with each passing day. The city continued on its course, indifferent. But for him, every corner seemed to carry its shadow. And it was in this emptiness that he began for the first time to feel the pain of something he had never experienced before, the genuine absence of someone who wasn't there to serve or admire him, but who, ironically, had been the only one to look at him without fear, without flattery, without masks. Her absence seemed to have opened an invisible crack in his life, and it was through this fissure that the world began to crumble. The society that had always applauded him, that raised glasses around him and revered him for his surname and fortune, suddenly turned its eyes with the same cruelty it had previously used against her. At first, it was just whispers, journalists investigating the origins of that young mother at the graduation party, gossip columns insinuating that the millionaire had turned the event into a stage for humiliation. Then, social media inflamed the narrative, with cell phone videos showing the exact moment the girl was ridiculed, laughter echoing, and him sitting without moving a muscle to defend her. What was once a mere ballroom spectacle became a public trial. Headlines appeared in newspapers. The heir who turned a single mother into a social gamble, arrogance exposed at an elite party. Groups began to question his family's legacy, pointing to past scandals of mass layoffs, now linked to the past of the young woman who had dared to stand up to everyone. What he had always believed invisible, the cruelty hidden behind the gilded walls, was now exposed to the world, and there was no turning back. In the corporate corridors, once filled with flattery, greetings turned cold. Investors began to press, questioning his leadership ability in a world where image and reputation were as valuable as figures. The friends who had encouraged him in his venture disappeared like shadows, fearing they would be associated with the scandal. Isolation, once a luxury he chose when he wanted silence, now became a condemnation imposed by the very society that had crowned him. And meanwhile, her absent figure became a constant presence in the collective imagination. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to appear. The memory of her firm gaze, her courageous speech in the face of humiliation, was enough to transform her into a symbol. People began to speak of her as the woman who, despite being poor, exposed the elite's dirty work, and the longer she remained silent, the stronger she became. It was as if her absence were the final judgment against him. The millionaire, for the first time in his life, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He discovered that wealth didn't buy absolution, that influence didn't erase truths, that charm didn't sustain broken masks. With each new headline, each new look of disapproval, the fall became more evident. This wasn't just a passing scandal. It was proof that even the most powerful could be crushed by the weight of their own arrogance. And in the midst of this public downfall, he realized the cruel irony of fate. He had destroyed his own reputation by trying to destroy hers. Karma, silent and inevitable, precisely returned every fragment of humiliation he and his peers had heaped upon her. And now, alone with the eyes of society fixed on his judgment, he began to feel not only her absence, but the need to understand the truth he had always avoided. Perhaps it was too late to repair the damage, but it was impossible to remain the same. Man after being stripped naked before the entire world. The public downfall not only tarnished his name, it stripped away the layers of pride and vanity he had always believed to be unshakable. In the days following the scandal, the millionaire lived in silence, locked away in luxurious apartments that suddenly seemed more like gilded cells than symbols of power. The mirrored walls, which had once reflected confidence, now revealed a tired face, marked by sleepless nights. For the first time, he found himself without an audience, without applause, without masks. Just himself and the shadow of himself. He began to question every gesture in his own life. What had he achieved, after all? Women who never truly saw him, friends who disappeared at the first sign of weakness, businesses that were sustained by the pain of entire families. The more he investigated her, the more he realized the abyss that separated their worlds, not by fate, but by choices his family had made. Every memory of the night at the party came back like an open wound. Her firm gaze, her courageous words, the silence that became an echo. And the more he thought about it, the more he understood there was something there that money couldn't buy. Dignity. Days turned into weeks, and he began to drift away from the routine that had always defined him. He stopped frequenting private clubs, ignored party invitations, and refused meetings where he knew he would simply be the heir, watched like a pawn. Instead, he began walking the city streets without security, observing the daily lives of ordinary people. It was on the sidewalks filled with street vendors, in the small, discreet cafes, in the quiet libraries, that he began to see a world he had always despised. He discovered there was beauty in silent effort, nobility in those who struggled without recognition, courage in those who rose each day, never knowing if they would have enough to survive. And in the process, something in him changed. His once arrogant gaze now held a shadow of regret. His hands, always accustomed to commanding, now sought to learn. For the first time, he didn't want to dominate. He wanted to understand. He began visiting single mothers' support centers, discreetly, without announcing his name, just to hear stories. Each account was a mirror of her life. Every tear, every tired smile, reminded him of the night she stood up against everyone and refused to be crushed. It was in this silent dive that the transformation took place. The man who had once used people as pawns now began to yearn for reparations. There was no immediate redemption, no public absolution. But within him arose the desire to be someone different, not because he needed to restore his own image, but because for the first time he felt the weight of his conscience. Her absence still stung like an open wound, but now it was more than a longing. It was the constant reminder of who he could have been if he had chosen a different path from the start. And it was like that, in the midst of his deepest loneliness, that he understood. He didn't need an audience, he needed change. And that change would only make sense if, one day, he could look her in the eye again and prove, not with words, but with actions, that he was no longer the same man who had turned her into a gamble. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious ballroom, nor in a setting prepared for grand revelations. Life, with its silent irony, chose the simplest of places to cross their paths again. It was a rainy afternoon in New York. The streets reflected the lights of cars in puddles that looked like broken mirrors. He walked alone, without security, his dark overcoat soaked and his face marked by deep, dark circles. He was searching for something he couldn't name, perhaps meaning, perhaps just a little peace. He entered a small neighborhood bookstore, the kind that survives more because of the owner's passion than profit. That's when he saw her. She was there, leafing through a children's book, with her son beside her, now older, his eyes still curious and lively. The world seemed to stop. For a moment he didn't know if it was reality or a mirage created by the longing that consumed him. His heart raced like never before, and the weight of everything that had happened came back to him all at once. He almost backed away, almost fled, as if he had no right to be in front of her. But she looked up and saw him. The time separating them vanished in seconds. Her gaze wasn't one of surprise nor of hatred. It was firm, mature, filled with a serenity that only those who have learned to survive pain could possess. She didn't smile, didn't cry, simply remained silent, as if waiting to see what man stood before her now. Her son tugged at her arm, asking who that man was, and she simply replied, "Someone who was once part of a story we don't need to hide." The simple phrase pierced his chest more powerfully than any accusation. He approached. Slowly, almost reverently. Gone was the arrogant smile, gone was the haughty posture, just a man carrying regret and a need to be seen as human. "I looked for you," he said, his voice cracking, lower than he would have liked. "I looked everywhere, but I think it was I who needed to lose myself to understand what I was truly searching for." She stared at him silently, letting the words fall like raindrops outside. There was no audience to watch, no spotlights, no whispers. Just them, amid forgotten books, faced with a truth that needed no dramatization. He wanted to say so much more, that he had changed, that he was trying to make amends, that he couldn't bear her absence. But words seemed insufficient compared to the silent dignity with which she watched him. It was then that for the first time he fell silent, and the silence between them was more honest than any speech. She closed the book slowly, took her son's hand, and simply said, "Time changes people, but it doesn't always change what happened." And with that she walked toward the door, leaving him there, caught between the fear of ultimate loss and the hope that there was still room for redemption. He didn't follow her immediately. He respected her pace, understanding that he was no longer the one making the rules. And in that moment he understood that their reunion wasn't just physical, but symbolic. It was the final confrontation between who he had been and who he could choose to be from then on. Days. After their reunion at the bookstore, he summoned the courage to seek her out again. Not with the arrogance of old, but with the humility of someone who knows he might not be welcome. He found the discreet address in a remote neighborhood, a street where children played on the sidewalk and the windows displayed simple curtains. Upon arriving, there were no security guards, expensive flowers, or prepared speeches. Just him, standing at the door, his gaze carrying the vulnerability of a man who, for the first time, was unsure of anything. When she opened it, she showed no surprise. She simply watched him silently, as if she had known this moment would come. He tried to speak, but his words tangled. He wanted to say he had changed, that he was trying to make amends, that her absence had been his greatest lesson. But she gently raised her hand, asking for silence. "I don't want to hear promises," she said in a calm, almost maternal tone. "I've heard enough throughout my life. I just want to see who you are now." That sentence carried more weight than any accusation. He followed her inside, the simple surroundings a stark contrast to the opulence he had grown up in. The small table, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the toys scattered on the floor. Everything spoke of a real life unmasked. They sat across from each other, and he finally managed to say, "I messed up. More than you know. Not just with you, but with everyone I carry on my shoulders like numbers. I can't change the past, but I want to change who I am now." His eyes were welling up, and it was clear he wasn't acting. She listened to him in silence, breathing deeply, as if weighing each word. Her son ran into the room, carrying a simple drawing on worn paper, 3 figures holding hands under a huge sun. The child smiled innocently, unaware of the symbolic weight of it. She looked at the drawing, then at the man before her. There was pain in her eyes, but also something else. Compassion. Life had taught her to endure, but also not to carry a grudge forever. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened," she said, her voice firm. "It's about not being a prisoner of the past, but forgiving doesn't mean going back. You have to walk alone and prove who you truly are. I've already made my choice to move forward without bowing to what they tried to do to me." The words fell like a sentence and a liberation at the same time. There was no kiss, no embrace, just the clear decision that she would no longer be a pawn in any game. He watched her, tears held back, and understood that this silent goodbye was, paradoxically, the only real chance to start over. Not with her by his side, but with her memory as his guide. A light rain fell over New York that night, turning the streets into silvery rivers beneath the city lights. He walked alone, without an umbrella, letting each drop run down his face as if in silent penance. He passed the same hotel where the graduation had taken place months before. The red carpet was gone, just wet, empty steps, silent witnesses to a night that had changed everything. He paused for a moment, staring at the illuminated entrance, and felt the echo of laughter, flashes, and arrogant looks. But instead of pride, he felt shame. Across town, in a small warm apartment, she was putting her son to bed. The boy clutched the drawing he'd made, now taped to the wall. On the paper, 3 figures holding hands still glowed in the soft light of the lamp. She stroked her son's hair, kissed his forehead, and turned off the light, leaving only the sweet silence of one who carries peace after the storm. As he walked down the deserted avenue, a group of businessmen recognized him from a distance. There were whispers, quick glances, but he didn't care. For the first time, he didn't need anyone's approval. His steps were heavy but true. He carried in his chest the weight of mistakes that could never be erased, and yet there was something new in him. The choice to no longer be the same. The imaginary camera would slowly pull back, showing the 2 distant worlds, the man walking in the rain, lost and seeking redemption, and the woman silently protecting her son, held high as a symbol of unbreakable dignity. There was no romantic reunion, no applause, only the contrast between 2 lives that touched for an instant and changed forever. And deep down, the silence said it all. Poetic justice was served not with revenge, but with the strength of a woman who refused to be broken, and with the downfall of a man who finally learned the price of his arrogance. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.